Thank you very much. Gordon Holden from the University of Alberta in Canada. And I don't know much about Australia, except I love this place. I do know that on that first fleet there were two artifacts, or two weapons if you wish. One was Blackstone's commentary on English laws, the other was a printing press. And that, I think, is the way in which I'm in the camp of the optimist that there may be the beginnings of a way out of this. I'd like to very quickly finish the story of Shepherd, because both speakers have mentioned it. This was a woman who didn't just take all this sitting down. She surreptitiously recorded it. She then sent it to the media, who then put it online and published stories about it. And within a few days, she had extracted an apology, a written apology from the president of the university and from the lead professor who had interrogated or tortured her in what I would call a star chamber. I would say kangaroo court, but I don't want to offend my Aussie friends here. In any case, there was an outcome which was positive. Now I fear for every case like hers, there may have been 50 who were cowed and didn't have that ability to fight back. My early impression of Aussies is that they're tough people, tough in the best sense of that word. For one thing, they beat us Canadians in almost every sport they try, or we try, exception of ice hockey, and I fear that'll be next. But I'd like to think that there's no reason why we have to be passive, and that there can be positive outcomes from not just gathering here in groups, but actually fighting back and using that printing press and all of its modern equations and modern outcomes to do precisely that. And that means to me that, that we don't have to accept the inevitable closing of the mind, but rather that, and if that happens, I think we have only ourselves to blame. So I guess my question after a rambling statement is there a way out, or can the media in particular be the means to successfully fight back?
Do you want to start as the comments?
I was having a discussion with colleagues from Labour Right a little while ago, and we were talking about the Australian media and the case of Bill Leak and what had happened and so forth, and the rise of political correctness and its penetration of the major public institutions. And I just asked, imagine Australia without the Murdoch press. What if Rupert Murdoch had never been born? So that is, it's the single bulwark against the rush, the flood of political correctness in this country. And so I think it shows two things. It shows what a brilliant individual can do, a brilliant, hard-working, disciplined individual can do, someone who believes absolutely in freedom of speech, someone who believes absolutely in Western civilisation and its brilliance. And so there's always hope when you think of someone like that and the Murdoch family. I think also there is a hope in the figure of Trump. However much you dislike Trump, he's done a very powerful thing, and that is to say that Western people have no need to feel guilty. They haven't done anything wrong. All civilisations enforced slavery. All major civilisations were terribly racist. All major civilisations were terribly classist. Islamic nations still, some of them use slavery, promote inequality under law. And one of the largest slave trades was the slave trade in Europeans by Muslim nations. So we need to remember history, and we need to be strong enough to fight back and to have the information to do that. And I think the media, the Murdoch press is very powerful in doing that. And there are also autonomous startups now, particularly in the US, that are instrumental in really making people feel as though they have every right to fight back when they're punished and bullied, and that it's absolutely not okay to be racist in reverse or to be sexist in reverse. We can't have double standards and have universal equality, so make your choice.
Thank you.
Well, absolutely. The fight back against this, as I suppose was trying to get towards the end of my speech, is to bring attention to it. Disinfectant. The sunshine is the best disinfectant when it comes to the ridiculous things that happen on campus. We saw the response to the recording, and the fact that we're talking about it literally thousands of kilometres away indicates the impact it's had and the embarrassment it's caused that university. And universities, more than anything else, are PR obsessed. they hate to see a negative story about themselves in the paper. So if you can bring attention in negative light, I mean, so our campus coordinator in Sydney, Renee Gorman, so she's organised a bunch of fantastic events on the failure of socialism and coal. But now the university has asked her to pay these security fees, and agree to pay security fees. You might have heard about this story. You would have seen it in the Daily Telegraph, and that was after we at the IPA, in fact, saw this issue. We thought it was quite problematic because there's a lot of this going on in the US, and we had a chat and exposed the story. There was all the documentation there from the university where, in fact, in one email, which sadly was never reported, the university basically suggested that we go somewhere else and don't have the event with them. So if you do bring light to these things, you do embarrass the university, and the university didn't actually end up charging security fees for the second event, as far as I understand. And hopefully, I suspect after this kind of publicity, they won't in the future. So if you bring attention to these issues, you can force them to change. Now, you can't deal with the people who are pushing these ideas in the first place as much as you might like, but you can make them less powerful.
Thank you. We have a question at the back.
So my name's Lee, I'm with Notre Dame University. So I want to say something a little bit heretical. I'm an unabashed fan of safe spaces. I love safe spaces. I'll tell you why. I go to one every Sunday. It's called my church. At my church, it's like an evangelical Baptist church. If you're a Roman Catholic, you're not welcome to speak. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're not welcome to speak. And I'm fine with that. Like, I love it. I would leave my church if they invited, like a liberal Baptist or an liberal Anglican speaker to come. And so I guess, there's lots of people out there who have stupid ideas. Like, I'm an anarchist. I'm sure a lot of people think my ideas are stupid, including probably people here. I think a lot of the people you've talked about, they have really, really stupid ideas. And I don't know how you can get rid of them. Like, they're around, they're not gonna vanish. They're probably not gonna be persuaded either. So isn't the real problem with all this stuff to universities is that, the government makes it very difficult to create new universities. So by the sounds of it, there's a market opportunity for people to create universities free of all the stuff you've talked about. Like, surely what we need is reform in education so that we can have universities free of this stuff, so people who don't like that stuff can go to these universities, and the people with dumb ideas can have their crap universities that burn to the ground.
Do you want to start, Matthew?
Sure. You're completely right. The red tape that is around establishing a university, or even I was speaking to somebody earlier today about establishing a new school, is quite prohibitive. Unfortunately, that means that there is a lot of policy work that needs to be done, and do watch this space. I think there has to be some development of, I suppose, every university in Australia, in fact, if you look at it, they're basically the same thing. There's, in the US, you have lots of different types of universities. You have the liberal arts colleges, you have big state schools, you have small private schools, you have all these different types of universities, and I suppose a far more competitive market that we don't really have here. So a student can go to the University of Chicago, for example, which has fantastic respect to free expression. So I completely agree. I think that is a substantial institutional policy problem that can be addressed. And you're completely right that I suppose in a private sense, if a private group of people want to associate and have a safe space and some others don't, that's their choice. As it stands though, universities are public entities, public funded, and at least in my view, have a greater responsibility in order to be able to basically achieve their core function, to explore ideas, to protect free expression.
Is your Baptist church in Perth?
Yeah.
No, that's a pity. If it were in Melbourne, I'd be coming to disrupt it this Sunday. But we all love Christ, and that's the main thing. So, safe spaces are terrible because they allow the mind to ossify. It means that you have no challenge. It breeds arrogance, a kind of very dangerous, the most dangerous kind of arrogance, which is based on ignorance. And what concerns me about the university sector at present is, in Australia, as in many other countries, it's based on a model that was created to foster greater equality. So the massification, and this is of course a made-up word, in the university sector. But the massification of the university sector meant that vast amounts of public funding now flow into universities. There is no tier system. The three-tier system of the US doesn't exist here. Following the Dawkins reforms, that was collapsed. So community colleges became accredited as universities. Now, I supported that in the beginning of my career in diversity, of course, until I had direct experience with students who came from a range of different equity groups. And what I found was that some students shouldn't have been classified as an equity group because they performed as well or better than any other students, and others should not have been at a university. It was doing them a disservice, and they ended up having to pay a lot of money for a degree that they were never, ever going to be capable of completing. So with the Dawkins reforms, with the Bradley reforms that we now have in Australia, which created the 40% participation target and a 20% target for low SES or low socioeconomic status intake, the attrition rates have gone through the roof. So that happens every time you try to really expand the base. So the question is, what is a university? What is the purpose of a university? What is a university education for? And do we need more specified tiers in Australia? I think we do, and I've spent a lot of time studying the performance of students from equity groups, and I think after that experience we absolutely do. If that were to happen, you would see a much greater mix of private and public funding. You'd see much greater private funding of professional tech colleges and so forth, and in fact they could offer, a lot of those courses could be just part of mentoring programs in businesses. So I think that has to happen. We need to create a clearer tier system in Australia again and admit that the Dawkins reforms have failed and the Bradley reforms have had a pretty mixed result. And we need to go back to a fairer model, I think, which actually cultivates the potential of individual students based on their capacities and their desires rather than substantive equality and ideological outcome.
Just at the back here.
My name's Garrick. My question is that why do you think cultural Marxism, particularly has taken root here in the West, particularly in college campuses, particularly after decades of staving it off here in the West and of universities? And why do you think traditionalism is on the rise in Eastern cultures such as Russia?
Well, as with all big revolutions, there has to be something that people have to like them. I mean, neo-Marxism was brought in with a militant revolution. So the 70s were very militant, remember. The revolutions were violent. People were killed, there were bombings in the US, we had the Weathermen, the SGS, very, very, very violent left-wing student groups. So it came by violence, but it also came by this cultivation of guilt. And for there's something in the Western psyche, some people believe it's born of the concept of original sin in Christianity, that people feel guilty. Westerners feel guilty. And they've been made to feel guilty, I think, because they've excelled in the world. And whenever someone reaches a position of excellence, of course, it is very easy to sow a culture of envy, where the envious feel that they do not have access to the goods, and the people who have achieved those goods are brought down in a system of levelling. There will always be, it's very easy to tap into envy. It's a universal human emotion, right? And the people in the Frankfurt School were highly intelligent, especially the psychoanalytic side, and this we don't discuss in public, but you should read if you can, Marcuse's Eros and Civilisation, because he describes so perfectly what do you talk about tradition, the resurgence of traditional culture. They called that the father culture, and so the authoritarian father figure was brought down by neo-Marxists, and he describes perfectly what kind of emotions and what kind of mental impulses they were going to tap into to bring them down. And it was basically envy and the desire to replace the father figure. So they were exceptionally clever people, and they were able to manipulate vast populations, I think. But also, Westerners were vulnerable and they wanted change. If they'd stopped with the civil rights movement, we would have had universal equality, and I think that would have been a good thing. But at the end of the 1970s, when truths about communism and the communist genocide were becoming known, and the money was running out, so the activists couldn't draw down on the state anymore because they were so indebted, they decided deliberately to introduce critical legal studies because there was a pushback by black letter lawyers and judges against the the special privilege system that they were trying to erect. So Kimberly Crenshaw talks about the beginnings of this critical legal theory movement and how they intended to bring affirmative action into law to supersede Marxism, really, and that was neo-Marxism. So it was also top-down. We very quickly got into a stage where the normative position was inequality under law, and people were prosecuted and vilified, and they lost their jobs and suffered terrible damage if they acted against that. So it's a combination of militancy, the genius really of the Frankfurt School theorists, and also that very basic human emotion of envy.
So I'm going to extend this session a bit. We're still going to have our break. I've got 2 questions here, if I could take them one after another.
Yes, hello, my name's Stuart Chapman. I'm involved. I've been a school principal and I'm interested in education. So, Jennifer, particularly to you, I was interested in your comments on unlearning, and I'm interested in what you might have to say about primary school, because what's happened is there's been push for making school compulsory, and in Western Australia we've lowered the entry point for education a year earlier, and now it's a big push to go even down to pre-kindy, so we're wanting 3-year-olds to go to school as well. So the motto, the 3-word slogan for the Labor Party is equity and fairness. And if you ask the Turnbull coalition team, I don't know what they have for their values statement. But what's happening in the schools, of course, is that it's not just, the damage is done by the time I think the students are reaching university, and the unlearning of family values is occurring right from the very start. You're a boy, you've got to accept your responsibility that you've got privilege. They're talking this to 4-year-olds and so on. So there's an attack on traditional conservative values right from the very young, and I think I'm interested in your take on the unlearning in the primary school system.
Thanks. We'll just have a quick question from Doug.
I want to make a quick comment first about hope, because I think the Heterodox Academy is a great hope in the academic world. In the political world, I mean, when Mark Latham's Offsiders programs bringing together people from the left and the right, particularly those on the left that are realising that this is a serious problem, I think we've got beginnings of hope in the political world. The Frankfurt School has created this army of dispersed micro-totalitarians throughout society. How much evidence is there that there's a coordinated program going on, or is it just a case of people seeking out similar people and just getting on with what they're being taught?
Okay, I'll just answer the second question first, because I think it's easy to answer. In the late 1970s and early 80s, there was a deliberate move to institutionalise the philosophical and theoretical precepts of neo-Marxism in law, in the university sector, in education, public education more broadly, and the media and other public institutions. So it was deliberate on the part of neo-Marxists at that stage. Once something becomes law, or once something is introduced as a policy in universities and workplaces, then everyone kind of has to accept it. They just sort of think it's normal. So you don't need to, very few people know what neo-Marxism is. You don't need to know. You have no, I was on the left for 15, 20 years, and very active on the left, and I didn't know. I had no idea. I was working in equity and diversity. You don't ask where it comes from. Why would you ask? It's just normal, isn't it? It's fair to help people who are minority groups. You don't question whether they're actually, what the meaning of minority group is and whether it's valid. In the Western context. So I don't think most people would know anymore, but there was a deliberate movement, and that's on record in the late 1970s and early 80s. They deliberately targeted law schools for that kind of ideology and also political studies, because they wanted to create they knew that the law and politicians had the whole country in their hands, and they wanted to ensure that they were able to capture the institutions through that method. On the second question, the obvious case to look at is the case of safe schools and building respectful relationships. That program. One of the more frightening aspects of totalitarian states is the deliberate divorce of children from their parents. A part of Rousseau wrote about it. He said that in the Enlightenment state, or he really wrote the first modern theory of totalitarianism, though he didn't use that term. But he said that the father must give up the rights to the child to be a good citizen, and why wouldn't he give the child over to the state to educate the child if he were really a good French citizen? Yep. So there was a deliberate effort to displace the father, and that theory was carried through by Mao Zedong, so there's quite a lot of literature of survivors of the communist regime, and the thought reform process was the most punishing aspects was that children were encouraged to denounce their fathers, and that was meant to be, and parents, and that was meant to be the best proof that they were successfully converted into politically correct comrades. There's a terrible, Frank Ducoulter writes about it in The Cultural Revolution, a terrible example of this, where a son dobbed in his mother. He just thought it was the right thing to do, and he dobbed in his mother, and she was shot for defacing a picture, or I think she threw a picture of Mao Zedong in the river or something. And he had to live with that guilt all of his life, once he was able to be deconditioned. And another example where a granddaughter was buried alive with her grandmother as punishment. So they punish the family, they try to break up the family. It's absolutely essential to the success of the totalitarian state. In terms of safe schools, we know that it was created by a Marxist. We know that the intention in the beginning, in part, was to defy parental authority. What shocked me about that, having worked in public programs, was that we were always taught in ethics, by ethics committees, that you had to gain signed parental consent. We had to meet with the parents to conduct educational programs, you had to get signatures, you had to work with the parent groups all the way through. That didn't happen, apparently, with safe schools, and that is a really shocking breach of ethics, in my view. And so, yes, I think they certainly don't have respect for parents, and some groups are trying to indoctrinate children very early, and they see no issue with it because, as I say, some of these leaders now are totalitarian in their mental, in the way they think. So to break up the family is an enemy. It's an obstacle in between the state and the child that needs to be captive.
I'll just make two very quick points. The first one I think is about the sense of conspiracy that can form around these kind of issues. My perspective is that this is not a grand conspiracy, but it is what you might call path dependent. So that basically the fact that the social science faculties post-war became increasingly larger and more diverse, and then more left-wing. It attracted more left-wing people, that then attracts more left-wing people, just because that's the nature of academia, is that you have professors who teach people who are graduate students, and they're going to teach them with their ideas, and if you're not predisposed towards the perspective of your of your professor, then you're probably not going to go into academia. So academia becomes quite one-sided as a consequence. So I think this is something that's happened naturally over time, which has limited the viewpoint diversity in academia, and is quite damaging for academia because it means that you don't have that contest of ideas. The second point I'll make about trying to indoctrinate children. So one thing the left constantly gets wrong, and this is obviously one of those many generalizations, but it is this kind of idea of human nature, and it goes back to this classic nature-nurture thing. They think that we're purely malleable to their wishes and very controllable. And that's, if you look at this idea of the blank slate, if you look at someone like Stephen Pinker, who's written about this extensively, you'll find this idea that we can be controlled by outside forces to be greatly exaggerated. And that's to say that the state can't actually control you and control what you think, and that there is, they can try to limit the information and try to force you to respond in a certain way, but they can't make you respond in a certain way to certain things. And individualism will always shine out against that. So I suppose that's the kind of more optimistic way to look at it, which is that this will ultimately fail because people do want to be individuals.
Two very quick questions first there, then to... Okay, last question.
Brian O'Brien in physics. I could just point your political correctness, you're targeting in your discussion just universities, a fairly elite group. And there's far more damaging political correctness to the public at large in the use of corrupt language such as climate change, and the corruptness of that increases the prices of electricity. How do you attack that?
We'll have Matthew, do you want to start, and then Jennifer, if you want a final word.
If you dislike an idea, fight back against it with better ideas. I mean, this is the essential need for free speech. So, in a sense, a level of political decorum, let's call it, people not intentionally going out of their way to offend people, it is probably a good thing for the national debate. You don't want people necessarily being offensive, but you do want the capacity to not see any idea as sacred and be willing to debate it no matter what. And that has to include any question of policy, particularly something like energy policy. And you do have to fight back against what you call in political correctness, just the attempt to shut down an opposing perspective.
Jennifer, final word.
If you want to reverse political correctness and restore the greatness of the West, vote in the next election and in every election after that one for a political party that explicitly supports limited government, the secular state, formal equality, and the basic liberties of freedom of speech and thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and freedom of association. The only way we're going to be able to reverse this without a kind of... some groups now are talking quietly to me about conscientious objection, if they're not allowed to express dissent from, say, a queer ideological view of human sexual relations and marital unions. So I think that you have to try to work as best you can in terms of with the political system, and if it doesn't change, we'll have to take the next steps, I suppose. Conscientious objection, perhaps.
Thank you. So we've got a 15-minute break now. We're moving the program slightly back a bit. Please thank Matthew and Jennifer.